오늘 가서 가르쳐 버렸으나 대장주 셈 줄에 깨와라 니지 첨부시키고 고려스 니지 첨부기에 대한 셈제 탐지.
Good morning. Last night then, we looked at that in order to generate bodhicitta, one has to first generate great compassion. Great compassion is the wish for all sentient beings without exception to gain freedom from suffering. And bodhicitta is the determined attitude that I will lead them to this state, I will lead them to gain freedom from suffering, and to do so I'll become a Buddha. So for the generation of these two minds, great compassion and then bodhicitta, one necessarily requires the foundation of wanting to gain liberation oneself from the sufferings of samsara. So this is an imperative to gain clarity of. First, one has to give rise to the determined attitude, I have to gain freedom from the sufferings of samsara, before one can give rise to a genuine wish to lead others to gain their freedom from the sufferings of samsara. Moreover, we looked at how to give rise to this determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara. One needs to train in recognizing that samsara and all the experiences and delights of samsara are pervaded by faults, are naturally subject to suffering. And in the reflection on how coming to recognize that samsara is pervaded by faults, is naturally subject to suffering, we need to come to recognize that nothing in samsara has any essence. So this term essence, or can be translated as no abiding value, what it means is that any object of samsara, whether it's a physical form, whether it's a body, whether it's something material, whether it's the normal values of samsara, these things have no abiding value, which means they cannot lead to any lasting happiness. In other words, any experience that one gains in samsara, any pleasure one gains in samsara, has no abiding value, has no essence. In other words, it cannot lead to lasting happiness. So that is the meaning of this term. In samsara, nothing has any essence or abiding value. And the way to recognize this is the 2 points that I mentioned last night, meditating on impermanence, that whatever it is that we desire, whatever state it is, whatever form it is impermanent, it's changing momentarily, it will not last. Therefore, the pleasure that is gained thereupon, it too will not last. It is slight, temporary pleasure at the best we can hope for. And moreover, when this life ends, all that we've accumulated will be left behind. All the pleasurable memories we have will be forgotten. So this is one part. The second part, that was impermanence, the second part is to challenge the mind of attachment, which exaggerates the good qualities of what we desire, and recognize that everything in samsara has also a negative side. It has faults. So therefore, whilst there are things that we need and we strive for and we need to attain, they do not lead to solely beneficial outcomes. There is a side that needs to be recognized that is faulty, that has its limitations, that may well lead to unwanted circumstances, unwanted outcomes rather. So this is an imperative meditation on the actual reality of samsara, which will lead us to gaining the mind of definite emergence, which is required to progress into the Mahayana. And here, it's very beneficial to recall the life that the Buddha Shakyamuni showed, the example that he showed in the life in which he turned the wheel of Dharma. He was born into the human existence, but not just any family, but a royal family. Therefore, he grew up with all the pleasures and prestige that comes with being a prince. And he was surrounded throughout the years of living in the palace, by all the power and influence, fame and reputation, wealth, comfort, and friendship that one would imagine that a prince would have. Later married, had a child, so he had everything that one could hope for. So he showed this example specifically to show that having all the delights of the human existence, the very supreme experiences that a human being could hope for, still does not lead to lasting happiness. You know from the life story of how when he left the palace briefly and he saw the experiences that others have, and he recognized those were coming for him too, of aging, of sickness and death. So this was an illustration, again, to emphasize this, that the Buddha gave us to show that there is nothing of abiding value, nothing of essence in samsara. There is no lasting happiness to be found. Therefore, he turned his back on that and sought the truth, sought reality, and he went forth and committed to training his mind. So again, this is a story that you know, so I don't need to repeat it. But he showed that the need to recognize the reality of samsaric existence and its grave limitations. And but that isn't the whole story. That by turning one's back on that and training in the correct path, the goal of Buddhahood can be achieved, as exemplified by his example of how he lived that life. And the Buddha showed this example as an example for his students, his followers, to follow. And that was done, and has been done, throughout the ages. We read about this in the biographies of the great masters from India, the great Indian Pandits, such as Shantideva, whose text we are studying on Wednesday nights, as well as the other great masters in the countries to which Buddhism spread, such as in Tibet. So we think of great Tibetan masters such as Lama, Tsongkhapa, and so many others, all of whom looked at independence on the teachings of the Buddha, looked at samsara with clear eyes, and recognized there's no abiding value here, but freedom is possible. And they let go of what binds them and strove to break those chains and gain freedom. So the section we just concluded, the measure of its development, that's concluded with that second paragraph that we looked at last night, which shows the sequence of training to become a bodhisattva. So for the generation of bodhicitta comes about necessarily independence and great compassion. Great compassion comes about necessarily independence on the cultivation of definite emergence. And definite emergence comes about independence on reflecting on the faults of samsara. So that's what we looked at last night. Now we come to the next section, the bottom of page 178, eliminating misconceptions. So here a doubt may arise. The meaning of what has been presented may be unclear to some who think that what has just been described, the need to recognize the faults of samsara and generate the mind of definite emergence, the determined attitude to strive for liberation, that this is the practice that the Theravadins, those of hero and solitary realizer lineage, need to engage in. This isn't for bodhisattvas. So this is a doubt that may well arise from the meaning of what is being said not appearing clearly in one's mind. So now the bottom page 178, the doubt, or the qualm. You may think it is explained in the Sutra of Teaching the Tathagata's Inconceivable Secret that if you cultivate extreme revulsion and disenchantment with cyclic existence, you will fall into the extreme of peace like the Shravakas because of your disgust for re-entering cyclic existence. Therefore, it is excellent for Hinayanists, but inappropriate for bodhisattvas to cultivate disenchantment. So this then is the doubt or the qualm. So the Tibetan starts the end of the second line in English. If you cultivate extreme revulsion and disenchantment with cyclic existence. So the you being referred to is a bodhisattva. So if a bodhisattva cultivates extreme revulsion and disenchantment with cyclic existence. So that this is the forming of the doubt, or the forming of the expression of the person's confusion that says, so someone who wants to become a bodhisattva, if they focus on recognizing that samsara has no abiding value, there's nothing of any essence in samsara, there's nothing with any abiding value in samsara, and thereby give rise to a determined attitude to emerge from samsara to gain liberation, so that is their doubt. Should a bodhisattva reflect in this way? So if someone who aspires to be a bodhisattva meditates deeply on the faults of samsara and gives rise to the mind of definite emergence, wanting to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara, striving to gain freedom from samsara, then the sentence continues, you, or the aspirant bodhisattva, will fall into the extreme of peace, like the Shravakas, so that the hearers, and we can include here solitary realizers, the Tibetan practitioners or practitioners of the Tibetan teachings, that if one trains in this way, then the aspirant to the bodhisattva paths will fall into the extreme of peace like the Shravakas, and because of their disgust for re-entering cyclic existence. So the disgust for re-entering cyclic existence means they do not want to take rebirth again in samsara. They want liberation from samsara. They do not want to ever again gain freedom, take rebirth in samsara. So therefore, the bodhisattva trains like a Shavaka or Pratyeka Buddha, here a solitary realizer, won't they too want to never again take rebirth in samsara? Then to explain this term, extreme of peace, you will the aspirant bodhisattva will fall into the extreme of peace. This means having the determined attitude to achieve one's own liberation. So the peace of liberation, a lasting, stable peace of mind or happiness, that is, from the bodhisattva's perspective, seen as an extreme of it striving to attain one's own freedom alone from samsara. So what will not the aspirant bodhisattva fall into such an extreme, in other words, wanting to achieve their own liberation solely? So the extreme of peace, this is the attainment of peace is the goals of a Shavaka. From the perspective of the bodhisattva, it is an extreme. So this is the peace of one's own individual liberation, one's own individual nirvana, that is attained through initially reflecting deeply on the reality of samsara, coming to recognize it has no abiding value at all, and thereby developing a disenchantment, a revulsion, a disgust for samsara. And with this follows the mind of definite emergence. I must strive for my own individual liberation through abandoning the afflictions together with the seeds. So this is the path of training for those of the Tibetan disposition, striving for their own individual liberation, their attainment of lasting mental peace or mental happiness. And it continues. So read the whole part. If you cultivate extreme revulsion and disenchantment for cyclic existence, you'll fall into the extreme of peace like the Shravakas because of your disgust for re-entering cyclic existence. So this is the view of Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhists, or hearers and solitary realizers. They do not want to re-enter samsara. They do not want to, or to, instead of re-enter, you can say, take rebirth in samsara. They want to gain liberation, their own individual nirvana. And the text continues, therefore, it is excellent for Hinayanists. So the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhists, the hearers and solitary realizers, this is their training, this is their goal. And that their training in terms of reflecting on the faults of samsara, giving rise to definite emergence, and striving to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds in order to gain their own individual liberation. So this is excellent for Hinayanists. This is the way they should train. Then it continues, and I've just changed the translation of this one word, but inappropriate for bodhisattvas to cultivate disenchantment. So here is the crux of the doubt, of the confusion, that a bodhisattva surely therefore should not develop disenchantment with cyclic existence. So we saw this before. Revulsion and disenchantment with cyclic existence. A bodhisattva should not cultivate that because a bodhisattva does need to re-enter cyclic existence or keep taking rebirth within samsara. Therefore, it is inappropriate for bodhisattvas to cultivate such disenchantment. The doubt comes down to this misunderstanding of, now we go to the beginning of our sentence, of the sutra. You may think it is explained in the sutra teaching the Tathagata's inconceivable secret. So this then is the source for this potential misunderstanding. They're thinking that whilst the Theravada practitioners strive to abandon or to develop disgust with samsara in order to generate definite emergence and thereby strive to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds and attain their own liberation. Now the person misunderstands this and thinking, and a bodhisattva should not do this. Otherwise they will, like the heroes and solitary realizers, not want to take rebirth in samsara, but will be striving for their own individual peace, their own individual liberation. So a bodhisattva necessarily needs to take continuous rebirth amongst suffering beings in order to benefit them. But because of the strength of the disgust generated, like a hero solitary realizer, a bodhisattva will not want to take rebirth amongst suffering beings. So this is the confusion which comes from a misunderstanding of this sutra. So Lama Tsongkhapa has included this misunderstanding here, so as he can, in a few moments, he can refute it, show the faults of this misunderstanding. But an important general point to also take from this is that the person who has this misunderstanding has a scriptural source that they are basing their view on. But one needs a broad education as well as the application of one's own logical reasoning to understand what one is reading, the teachings one is receiving, and so forth. And that is what has not been applied here. The logical reasoning is absent for the person who is quoting the scriptural source, but not understanding it more broadly, not seeing the broader context. Because what they are seeing as contradictory is the training of a practitioner of hero and solitary realizer lineage as being contradictory to the training required for bodhisattvas. They see these two as separate. They are not recognizing how one is built on the other. The bodhisattva training is built on the shared trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. They are not recognizing this because of not using their logical reasoning correctly. Hence, they are asserting this view based on a scriptural source, but it has a fault. And that is what Lama Tsongkhapa will now clear up. So that presents the qualm, the doubt, the misunderstanding. Now, the response from Lama Tsongkhapa in 4 parts. So the first part, the meaning of the statement. So this is now a quotation from that sutra. Thus, a bodhisattva should not be terrified by cyclic existence, is not to point out that he, so the bodhisattva, should not be repulsed by the sufferings of birth, aging, illness, and death, and so on, of wandering in existence under the power of karma and the mental afflictions. Rather, and I've just needed to change this a little bit, rather it is that he should not be terrified of taking rebirth in existence for the benefit of sentient beings under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So I'll read that last sentence again because this one bit isn't in the Tibetan, and I'll change one word. Rather, it is that he should not be terrified of taking rebirth in existence for the benefit of sentient beings under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. In this paragraph, there are 2 ways that one takes rebirth as a human or God are presented. So there are 2 ways one takes rebirth as a human, desire realm God, or a formless realm God. So the one way is how we came into this existence, which is under the control of karma and afflictions. It wasn't under our own free will, it was under the control, the power of karma and afflictions. This is samsaric rebirth, this uncontrolled rebirth in samsara. Uncontrolled in the sense, It's not under our own free will. It's under the control, the power of our karma and afflictions. So this is one means by which one takes rebirth as a human or as a god, whether a desire realm god or a form realm god. And this is rebirth in samsara. The second means is not under the power of karma and afflictions, but by means of aspirational prayers and compassion. So that we see at the end of the paragraph. This is the second means by which one can take rebirth as a human, a desire realm god, or form realm god, is under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So this can be likened to people coming to Australia. So some will come for the reason of moving here. Others will come here with the motivation of temporarily staying here, maybe visiting, maybe staying for just a few years. So there will be differing motivations to come to Australia. And likewise, there are different means of travel into the realms of humans and gods. One means of travel is under the control of karma and afflictions. The other is under the control of, or by means of, aspirational prayers and compassion. So bearing in mind, there are these two means by which rebirth as a human or god are taken. It continues. Thus, bodhisattva should not be terrified by cyclic existence, is not to point out that the bodhisattva should not be repulsed by the sufferings of birth, aging, illness and death, and so on, of wandering in existence under the power of karma and mental afflictions. So here we see, under the wandering in existence, or samsara, under the power of karma and the mental afflictions. So this is the one means by which one takes rebirth, under the power of karma and mental afflictions. And the bodhisattva should develop repulsion for the sufferings of birth, aging, illness, death, and so on. So the threefold, sixfold, eightfold divisions of suffering. The bodhisattva should reflect on that and develop a revulsion for taking rebirth in existence, or samsara, under the power of karma and mental afflictions. Now in the next sentence, this explains the meaning of that quotation above. Rather, it is that the bodhisattva should not be terrified of taking rebirth in existence, or samsara, for the benefit of sentient beings under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So we see here, if we then link back to the quotation, thus a bodhisattva should not be terrified by cyclic existence. And here we see the meaning of not be terrified of cyclic existence as being not be terrified of taking rebirth in existence, or cyclic existence, or samsara, for the benefit of sentient beings, under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So therefore, the bodhisattva will have developed a revulsion for taking rebirth under the power of karma and afflictions, but will want to take rebirth under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. Why? Because of fulfilling their compassion, the meaning of their compassion, which is to lead each and every being to attain their own liberation from suffering. For the quotation, thus a bodhisattva should not be terrified by cyclic existence, is explained by understanding the two ways by which rebirth as a human or god, whether a god of the desire or form realms, is taken. And the bodhisattva develops a revulsion for rebirth due to karma and afflictions, just like the heroes and solitary realizers. But because of their great compassion and bodhicitta, they, unlike the heroes and solitary realizers, do want to continue to take rebirth amongst the objects of their compassion, suffering beings. So therefore, under the power of their compassion and aspirational prayers, they want to be reborn as a human or as a god, in order to benefit suffering beings. So this is the meaning of this quote, and therefore it should be understood very clearly what a bodhisattva rejects, which is rebirth under the control of contaminated karma and the afflictions, and what the Bodhisattva embraces, ongoing rebirth amongst suffering beings under the control of their compassion and aspirational prayers. So this first part of the response from Lama Tsongkhapa makes clear the two ways by which rebirth is taken. And the bodhisattvas reject the one. They have a revulsion for the one, which is rebirth due to karma and afflictions. Rather, they embrace with an attitude of joy and delight, taking rebirth due to compassion and prayers, wanting to be amongst the objects of their compassion so as to benefit them. So this is a very clear divide within the mind of the bodhisattva. And then Lama Tsongkhapa continues in the second part of his response. In fact, as we wander in existence, or samsara, under the power of karma and the mental afflictions, we are oppressed by many sufferings and cannot even bring about our own welfare, let alone anyone else's. I'll read the sentence again. In fact, as we wander in existence under the power of karma and the mental afflictions, we are oppressed by many sufferings and cannot even bring about our own welfare, let alone anyone else's. So this is the reality of our situation, and it's something that the bodhisattva, or the aspirant bodhisattva, also recognizes. And that is, whilst one is under the control of karma and afflictions, one's mind is greatly deluded. One will also, in addition to that, continue to suffer. So this we know as ordinary beings. But a bodhisattva also recognizes the limitations that they are placed under because of being subject to karma and afflictions. Because as long as one is under the influence of karma and afflictions, one will experience unwanted circumstances. So from our own existence, we know this: mental unhappiness, physical suffering, conflict with others, and the ongoing effort to sustain the body. And for an ordinary bodhisattva, they have the same experiences, or they also need to sustain their body and so forth. They experience these things in a different way, but nevertheless, they have limitations. And also, on the mental level, due to not yet being perfected beings, their ability to be of benefit to others is impeded. So therefore, there is a recognition that not at how limited one can be in terms of benefiting others because of one's own inner limitations, one's own limitations in one's own spiritual development. And this is the meaning of and cannot even bring about their own welfare, let alone anyone else's. Their own freedom from suffering hasn't been achieved. Their own, in other words, their mind is still affected by afflictions. Therefore, their capacity to be able to help others perfectly is greatly impeded. They are yet to help themselves become perfected beings. So this is the recognition of both an aspirant bodhisattva and a bodhisattva. I have to abandon the state I am in now of taking rebirth under the control of karma and afflictions and gain freedom from this. Then the text continues, and here there's just a part of it, a few words. I've needed to move to the end. Okay. So since this is the door to all degeneration, we must develop extreme disenchantment, even more than the Hinayanists, in order to block it. So read the sentence again. Since this is the door to all degeneration, we must develop extreme disenchantment, even more than the Hinayanists, in order to block it. So since this is the door to all degeneration, what is the door to all degeneration? It is, looking at the previous sentence, taking a rebirth and existence under the power of karma and the mental afflictions. As long as we have a body such as this, a life such as this, that has come about independent on contaminated karma and afflictions, we will suffer. This is something that's been looked at in detail in this chapter and the previous chapter, recognizing that as long as one is subject or under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions, one will suffer. This is why we experience physical suffering, mental suffering, and our environment is challenging. The need to continually sustain this body, sustain this life, that is always, as if on a knife edge, subject to ever more suffering. The reason we are in this state of degeneration or this state of continual suffering or potential suffering, is because this rebirth has come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. So since this is the door to all degeneration, we, or bodhisattvas and aspirant bodhisattvas, must develop extreme disenchantment even more than Hinayanas or Thervadins in order to block it. So the meaning here is that aspirant bodhisattvas, and certainly also bodhisattvas, recognize that as long as they are under the control of karma and afflictions, they will have experienced unwanted circumstances, but moreover, they are limited in terms of the benefit they can bring to others. Moreover, third component, they also recognize the situation that others are in, being under the control of karma and afflictions. So there is a twofold response here. One, having recognized their own situation, they have then given rise to a determined attitude to gain freedom. And in addition, they trained thereafter in developing compassion for others in the same situation, under the control of karma and afflictions. And therefore, their compassion is generated. And then, in addition to this, the third component, they recognize that not only do I need to benefit others, but I am limited in the benefit I can bring. Why? Because I am far from being a perfected being. I still have my limitations. And this is true for both aspirant bodhisattvas and regular ordinary bodhisattvas too. And furthermore, since it's the door to all degeneration, we must develop extreme disenchantment, even more than Thervadins. So why extreme disenchantment, even more than Thervadins? A Thervadin, a practitioner of Shavaka or Pratyeka Buddha lineage, the heroes and souls who realize the lineages, they are determined to gain their own individual nirvana, their own individual state of lasting peace. And therefore, that is their focus. The bodhisattva, though, is striving to benefit suffering beings. Therefore, is wanting to abide amongst beings who are suffering in order to benefit them. Therefore, they will be continuing to be around what stimulates their afflictions. They are not having as the forefront of their objective freedom from the afflictions, and therefore what stimulates them. Rather, they are wanting, at the forefront of their motivation, is to benefit suffering beings. So therefore, they need particularly strong renunciation or disenchantment, because they are needing to be amongst those in need, needing to be amongst those who require help and guidance. This is why the disenchantment that a bodhisattva needs to develop is extreme, even more so than the Thervadins. It continues with, and enjoy taking rebirth in existence with samsara under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So here, this links to what we saw before, that the bodhisattva wants to continue to take rebirth among suffering beings in order to benefit them, but does not want to take rebirth among suffering beings under the control of karma and afflictions, but rather under the control or power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So this is what we've looked at before, and now an additional element of this word translated as enjoy or delight. So the bodhisattva, because of their power of compassion, actually delights in taking rebirth amongst suffering beings. So it's through the bodhisattva's enthusiastic perseverance that they know that every hardship can be overcome. And they therefore take delight because they know that in being in challenging circumstances, they can benefit beings and thereby lead those beings to their liberation, and the bodhisattva themselves will continue to progress towards enlightenment. When we ask ourselves then, if we make a comparison between hero and solitary realizer practitioners and ordinary bodhisattvas, those on the bodhisattva paths of accumulation and preparation, which has the stronger definite emergence, the stronger determination to abandon samsara and the suffering realms of samsara, there's not even a comparison that can be made. The bodhisattva's determination is so much stronger. And because of the strength of the definite emergence of the bodhisattva, they actually delight in encountering challenging circumstances. They view hardships with a joy, or they encounter hardships with a joy because they know these hardships will not overcome them, but rather enhance their bodhicitta, enhance will enhance their bodhicitta by giving them opportunities to help others. So therefore, with joy and with a smile, bodhisattvas embrace challenging circumstances because they know through them they can directly benefit others and indirectly continue towards their attainment of enlightenment and becoming ever more skilled thereby in helping others. So to attain liberation from suffering, the afflictions together with their seeds need to be abandoned. And when the afflictions together with their seeds are abandoned, one is liberated from ever suffering again. One is liberated from the suffering realms of samsara. One has attained a state of lasting happiness. This is the case for all practitioners of whatever type, of whatever lineage. So I want this to be clear, that both the similarity between the bodhisattvas on the one hand and heroes and solitary realizers on the other, as well as the key distinction. So the similarity is, in order to gain freedom from uncontrolled rebirth in samsara due to karma and afflictions, every practitioner of any lineage needs to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds. No distinction. The distinction comes in terms of the hero and solitary realizers, the Theravada practitioners. They are looking to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds in order to attain that state of liberation and nothing more. Or to express it differently, the peace of liberation. That is what they're looking for. So at the bottom of the previous page, we had the extreme of peace. So this peace, the state of lasting mental happiness, that is the state of liberation, which is attained through the abandonment of the afflictions together with their seeds. That and that alone is the goal of the hero and solitary realizer. That is their own individual liberation. The bodhisattva wants to engage in the same process of abandoning uncontrolled rebirth in samsara due to karma and afflictions by abandoning the afflictions together with the seeds. There, no difference from the hero and solitary realizer. The difference comes, the bodhisattva does not desire the peace of liberation. They do not, that is not their goal. Their goal is not the state of lasting mental peace. That is the state of the hero and solitary realizer. So that is the distinction between them. The hero and solitary realizer is striving solely for their own individual liberation, their own state of lasting peace. That goal is not the goal of the bodhisattva. The means that leads to the attainment of that goal, this is shared with the bodhisattva, the abandonment of the afflictions together with their seeds, through developing a deep revulsion for cyclic existence. That is shared, but the goal, that differs. The heroes and solitary realizers, the Theravada practitioners on one side and the bodhisattvas on the other, they have a lot in common, but their motivation and therefore their goal, that is what differs. Within there, there is a lot that is in common. Not everything, but there is a lot that is in common. So all three types of practitioners, the two types of Theravada practitioners, hearers and solitary realizers, as well as the Mahayana practitioners, the Bodhisattvas, what they share, what they have in common in their training, is they reflect deeply on the faults of samsara, true sufferings, as well as the causes of suffering, the contaminated karma and afflictions, true origins. And they both develop a disenchantment with samsara, this attitude of, there's nothing here of any abiding value. I want to gain freedom, the mind of definite emergence. And this freedom is attained through abandoning the afflictions together with their seeds. And therefore, they strive to abandon their afflictions together with their seeds. This is all shared between these types of practitioners, the Theravadins and the Mahayanists. That is shared. The difference is, in terms of not the middle part, but primarily, or not solely the middle part, but primarily the motivation and the goal. The goal differs greatly. The hero and solitary realizer wants to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds and attain the peace of their own individual liberation and nothing more. Their goal is their own individual peace. The Bodhisattva, though, does not see that goal as sufficient. That goal does not draw them. In fact, they reject that goal. So therefore, the Bodhisattva's goal is far greater. They don't only want to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds, although they do. It's not that alone. They also want to abandon the stains of the afflictions. So again, both groups of practitioners, Theravada and Mahayanist, see the faults of samsara, develop definite emergence, and strive in their abandonment of the afflictions together with their seeds. But the Theravada practitioner wants to go no further than that. They want to abide in a state of lasting peace. Whereas the Bodhisattva rejects that, does not want that, but wants to continue their process of spiritual development, and whilst doing so, continue to help. So, from what I've just said, what should be clear is that all practitioners strive to reject rebirth in samsara under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. So whether the practitioner is a Theravada or a Mahayanist, they strive to abandon, to gain freedom from rebirth in samsara or existence under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. So that is the same between the various practitioners. But then bodhisattvas alone embrace, as we see at the end of the sentence, enjoy taking rebirth in existence or samsara under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So the bodhisattva yearns to take rebirth in samsara, but due to a different reason, not under the control of karma and afflictions, that's rejected, but under the control or the power of prayer and compassion. So here, it's not merely that the mode or the means by which rebirth is taken differs, although it certainly does. The bodhisattva only wants to take rebirth under the power of prayer and compassion. But the way of understanding this needs to be clear. What the bodhisattva is wanting to do is not to be reborn in samsara, which would mean under the power of karma and afflictions, but amongst samsaric beings. In other words, the bodhisattva themselves is reborn due to the power of their compassion and their aspirational prayers, not under the power of their contaminated karma and afflictions. But surrounding them are beings that need to be benefited. So this is what the bodhisattva wants, is not to be a being of samsara, but rather to be amongst samsarian beings. This is the goal of bodhisattvas. So therefore, when we see here, enjoy taking rebirth in existence, we should be very clear that the bodhisattva doesn't want a mind that is under the control of karma and afflictions, or to take rebirth under the control of karma and afflictions. This is the mark of a being of samsara. The Bodhisattva wants to be amongst such beings because they need their guidance, they need their help and assistance. But the Bodhisattva wants to gain liberation from that state in order to be able to benefit more. So this is a key point to understand in terms of what a Bodhisattva means by enjoying taking rebirth in existence. They are looking to take rebirth under the power of compassion and prayer. Let's talk then about the 5 Mahayana paths, or the 5 Mahayana paths, in particular the first two, where the Bodhisattva is an ordinary being, a being who has not yet realized emptiness directly. So looking at these first two of the Bodhisattva paths, the path of accumulation firstly, here the Bodhisattva takes rebirth and under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. So just like an ordinary being, though the contaminated karma is going to be virtuous and powerful, nevertheless, the Bodhisattva takes rebirth under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions on the path of accumulation. This is also the case on the path of preparation. However, in the path of preparation, the Mahayana path of preparation, there are four parts: heat, peak, patience, and supreme mundane qualities. So the first two, heat and peak, there the Bodhisattva, under the power of karma and afflictions, in theory, can still, like on the path of accumulation, be reborn in any of the realms of samsara, including the lower realms. On the third, or from the third part of the path of accumulation, as well as the fourth, so that of patience and supreme mundane qualities, there, the power of the bodhicitta and the wisdom realizing emptiness is such that the bodhisattva, whilst still taking rebirth under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions, cannot be reborn in the lower realms, so only as a human or god. So what we see here is on the two paths of ordinary bodhisattvas, rebirth is still taken under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. And for much of this time, in theory, the bodhisattva, under the power of their karma, can be reborn in any of the 6 realms. But of the 4 levels of the Mahayana path of preparation, this is still the case on the first 2, heat and peak, but on the third and the fourth, that of patience and supreme mundane qualities, the bodhisattva, while still being under the rebirth, being under the control of karma and afflictions, can only take rebirth as a human or god. The door to the lower realms is closed. Then, when the bodhisattva comes to realize emptiness directly and becomes an Arya being, from that point, the bodhisattva will no longer ever again take rebirth under the control power of karma and afflictions, now solely under the control of prayer and compassion. To make this even clearer, so what has been just said of the 4 parts of the path of Mahayana path of preparation, the third and fourth, that of patience and supreme mundane qualities, the bodhisattva will no longer be reborn in the lower realms because of the quality of the wisdom realizing emptiness and bodhicitta. Prior to that, it is certainly possible. Now let's look at this likelihood, the possibility prior to the third and fourth level of the Mahayana path of preparation. So whilst in the same way that the Mahayana path of preparation has 4 divisions, the first path, that of accumulation, has 3 divisions: small, middling, and great. So the new bodhisattva attains the small part of the path of accumulation. There, rebirth, or from there, rebirth in the lower realms certainly is possible. From the attainment, the development of the bodhicitta and the wisdom understanding emptiness, and they through that being developed, and they attain first the middling part of the path of accumulation and later the great part of the path of accumulation. From there, as well as in the first 2 stages of preparation, heat and peak, whilst rebirth in the lower realms is theoretically possible, it's really unlikely. Unlikely as in it's probably not going to happen, but the bodhisattva doesn't yet have the capacity to say not possible, but it's highly unlikely. So really the only time that the bodhisattva is in danger of being reborn in the lower realms under the power of karma and afflictions is when they're a new bodhisattva on the first part of the path of accumulation, the small part of the path of accumulation. So what I've said, this is largely agreed across the various Buddhist philosophical tenets. There is, though, some difference. So, for example, the Vaibhashika, they hold that when the bodhisattva attains the heat level of the path of Mahayana path of preparation, so the third of the four levels of the Mahayana path of preparation, they, in that very life, will attain Buddhahood. They will not die and take rebirth again. That is the life in which they become a Buddha. But the tenets of the middle way, they do not hold that view. They will say once the heat level of the path of preparation is attained, there are still many, many lives to be taken. The bodhisattva, whilst having done so much, still has to accumulate an extensive amount of merit before Buddhahood is attained. So there are differences in the different Buddhist philosophical tenets. And so from this, you can understand that if the Vaibhashika, the great exposition school, states that when a bodhisattva attains the third level of the path of Mahayana path of preparation, the heat level, that they will not, that will be the very life in which they attain Buddhahood. That means that life was that life was attained under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, the body of that practitioner who will go on to achieve enlightenment, and then the body of the enlightened being, is a true suffering. It is subject to illness and so forth. And again, the reason is because that body was taken or appropriated under the power of contaminated karma and afflictions. So therefore, the Vaibhashika state that the body of a Buddha is a true suffering, subject to illness and so forth. Then the third part of Lama Tsongkhapa's response, in accordance with that, the same sutra also states. So here I've changed a lot, so apologies. Bodhisattvas, having fully embraced completely ripening sentient beings, view cyclic existence as having benefits, but not their own great nirvana. So I'll read it again. Bodhisattvas, having fully embraced completely ripening sentient beings, view cyclic existence as having benefits, but not their own great nirvana. So Lama Tsongkhapa, as throughout the text, draws on quotations to show the validity of what he's just stated. So therefore the meaning of this quotation is as we've just seen above. So reading the first part, Bodhisattvas have fully embraced completely ripening sentient beings. So in other words, the way that a bodhisattva sees samsara is that there is benefit for them, as the bodhisattva, to be amongst suffering beings. So therefore, for the bodhisattva to be amongst beings bound in samsara, they recognize as greatly beneficial because they can directly fulfill their bodhisattva aspiration and benefit beings. Continuing in the text, here again some minor change here. It is set forth in bodhisattva levels that if someone with bodhisattva vows expresses themselves in the above manner and fails to differentiate the two, they commit an afflictive misdeed or permeated with a misdeed permeated with afflictions. So it is set forth in bodhisattva levels that if someone with bodhisattva vows expresses themselves in the above manner and fails to differentiate the two, they commit a misdeed permeated with afflictions. The meaning then is similar to above. It is set forth in the Bodhisattva levels that if someone with the Bodhisattva vows expresses themselves in the above manner and fails to differentiate the two. So the above manner refers to the qualms at the bottom of page 178, that doubt, and differentiate between the two meaning, differentiate between taking rebirth in samsara due to contaminated karma and afflictions, and taking rebirth amongst beings of samsaric beings, due to prayer and compassion. These are the two, to differentiate the two means by which one takes rebirth. So if the bodhisattva has such a doubt as expressed at the bottom of the previous page, and therefore fails to differentiate between the two ways of taking rebirth, they commit a misdeed permeated with afflictions. So they commit such a misdeed because of failing to differentiate between the type of rebirth which is to be abandoned due to contaminated karma afflictions, and the type of rebirth among samsaric beings which is to be striven for, rebirth under the power of compassion and prayer. So we'll conclude there for this morning. So we still have time. If you have questions, please ask. But the first question was messaged during the teaching last night from Zoom. And so I'll say the question, then Gendo will give his answer. What is the best way to develop a neutral but compassionate mind? I'll read the question again. What is the best way to develop a neutral but compassionate mind? So to develop a compassionate mind requires the prior training in not just what was mentioned last night, but also developing the attitude of equanimity or impartiality. And as a translator, I'm thinking that is what is meant by the term here neutral, or the word here neutral. So then back to what Genla said. So the training in how to develop a mind of equanimity or impartiality is presented as the foundation for the sevenfold cause and effect method to develop bodhicitta. So it's, you could say, step 0 in the 7 points. So how to train then or to develop an equanimous or impartial attitude. So what one is wanting to challenge is this current lack of equanimity or our current partiality, where we emotionally are closer to some and distant from others. And we challenge this closeness to some and distance from others by using logical reasoning. We come to recognize that whilst we can say, yes, I recognize that this person, these people have acted in ways that have brought benefit to me directly and indirectly, and others have shown me kindness, and I can say that. I can only, though, say that in relation to what, with my limited intelligence, I can recognize in this life. So I can recognize that these people have done things that have benefited me and have shown me kindness. There are many others who do things that benefit me, but I don't even recognize this. I'm not aware of it. Moreover, when we look back over the expanse of lives that we've had in various life forms that we each have been born into, we recognize that we have had a variety of relationships with all beings. So in this life, we can say, with these people have had these relationships, but we recognize even within that, there is change. So too, when we then expand across the realms of lifetimes, or the expanse of lifetimes, and the various forms in which we've been born, we recognize that beings who have brought benefit to us in this life, in ways that we recognize and ways we do not recognize, have done so in lives past too. And those who perhaps haven't shown us kindness in this life, or we have had no contact with in this life, in many lives in the past, they have shown us tremendous kindness. So thereby, by using logical reasoning, we break down the foundation or the basis upon which we say, you have shown me kindness, you have shown me harm, and recognize this is not the entirety of our relationship. And therefore, we use this to recognize all beings have value. All beings have value in the sense of they have shown me kindness, they have done things which have benefited me. I have no basis to discriminate between them, holding some as dear and others as enemies. There's no basis for this. All are equal in value because of how they've related to me across the expanse of lifetimes. So this is how one develops equanimity or impartiality, and this is a neutral attitude in the sense of one overcomes the closeness to some and the distance from others, and that is the requirement to develop a compassionate mind. Then other questions?
In the path of preparation, there's four levels. What does heat and peak refer to?
So in the four levels of the path of preparation, what does the term heat refer to and the term peak refer to? To explain heat first. So let's say there's a source of fire over there. You can feel the heat over here. So that is the meaning, but in relation to the realization of emptiness. So whilst the fire is there and you are here, you are able to recognize you are close to the source of heat, close to the fire. The fire, now to turn it to wisdom, the fire of wisdom that will burn away the confusion of ignorance. You recognize, because you have now attained the path of preparation, that you are coming ever closer to that direct realization of emptiness. So this is the meaning of heat. So a peak refers to, you could say a peak as in mountain peak, the highest point of a building, that is the meaning of peak. How it then relates here to emptiness is first there's the heat, so you recognize you are close. Now peak is your understanding of emptiness is growing, or your realization of emptiness is growing. So it's to reach a peak. So it's the heat has got hotter, or you've attained a peak. Then the first was heat, the second is peak, the third then is patience. So patience is most often, in this context, not translated as patience, it's the same word, but as forbearance. So maybe forbearance is better, or perhaps tolerance, the same word is translated differently. Maybe forbearance is better, because with the attainment of this third level of the path of preparation, or the path of preparation, one will no longer be reborn in the lower realms. So that is the Dharma attainment. The meaning of why the term forbearance is applied is that just like something being unbreakable, it meets a force but cannot break. So it can forbear that force. So in this way, the meaning is, because of the qualities of the practitioner's mind, the level that has been developed of qualities in the practitioner's mind, they will not take rebirth in the lower realms. And therefore, they have a forbearance, a strength, an unbreakability. So the four levels: heat, peak, forbearance. Now the fourth, supreme mundane qualities. So this is, as the name says, the being is still a mundane or a worldly and ordinary being, but they are at the supreme level of this. They are supreme amongst ordinary beings, because their wisdom is supreme amongst non-Aryas, amongst ordinary beings. They are very close, because they're at the fourth level of the path of preparation. They're very close to where their wisdom will directly realize emptiness, and they'll attain the path of seeing and become an Arya being. So this is why they are supreme. They have qualities that are supreme amongst mundane or ordinary or worldly beings. Okay, then thank you, and enjoy your lunch.